intellectual in ways that strike people as machine-like, and socially awkward in ways that strike people as machine-like. These nerds are people who remind others, sometimes pleasantly, of machines. They tend to remind people of machines by, and this first point is the key one, being passionate about some technically sophisticated activity that doesn't revolve around emotional confrontation, physical confrontation, sex, food, or beauty. Speaking in a language unusually similar to written standard English, seeking to avoid physical and emotional confrontation, favoring logical and rational communication over nonverbal, non-rational forms of communication, or thoughts that don't involve reason, working with, playing with, and enjoying machines more than most people do. And those are all, if you think about Walter as fulfilling all of those, you know, he definitely, by the end of the show, is completely about confrontation and all the things. So we've got in the show represented these two stereotypes in opposition. Hank is a beautiful example of the sort of stereotypical American male in a lot of ways. These ways, really briefly, include things like a man always being ready to, first of all, the same quote that you referred to, what does a man do? A man provides, and so that, of course, is key. But then also, a man is competitive and confrontational all the time. So somebody like Ken, with the Ken Wins license plate, somebody like that is actually not a bad example of a man, except that he's completely sociopathic. He has no connection to anybody else. He's doing everything he does for himself. So the stereotype is basically a sociopath with an excuse, the excuse of family. So Hank is my example of, in a lot of ways, the stereotypical male. Gail is, of course, the beautiful example. He even uses the word nerd. After he quotes Walt Whitman, he says, "Yes, I am a nerd." And they have sort of a nerd bonding moment the first day in the lab. You know, they're both saying, "Yes, I love the lab too." You know, and they're sort of bonding over their ability with the machines and their love for the machines. And of course, it's Walt's death scene. You know, he sort of dies caressing his machines. Those are the main outlines. I also don't have time to go into it much, but I looked at the first 15 minutes. My argument is that the first 15 minutes of the pilot establish that Walt's problem is that he's not a man in the terms that we would use for that. And that's what he sees quickly because of his cancer diagnosis that he has to do, to become a man in cultural terms. And that he does so eventually, but again, that's the tragedy, that's the whole problem.
And of course you can see that our book is sort of looking at Breaking Bad as really a serious examination of masculinity in our culture, the ways in which it's toxic, the ways in which traditions could perhaps potentially be a positive form of masculinity, as your chapter. But taking it seriously as a critique of masculinity, we, of course, one tends to focus on Walter. And what I thought I'd do for this roundtable to just sort of stimulate discussion among ourselves would be to look at the male characters besides Walter. And, but feel free to bring Walter back into this. But I look at the characters besides Walter, and I'm just going to ask each of my authors here to choose a secondary character, secondary because Walter's the primary, and tell me something interesting from the perspective of your chapter about that one character. Let's see, Ian.
Yeah, okay, so she asked me about this. My response was Hector Salamanca. I think he's my first slide, you know, and it's a great, very fascinating character because Hector, I mean, one of the few things he actually articulates is the family is all, as he's torturing his grandchildren. The family is all, right, or his nephews. But you know, Hector is all about legacy. That's all about what he is. He's all about not himself, but making sure that something of himself lives on through the boys or through whichever other means. And you can always tell, I think, in Breaking Bad, what's important to a character, maybe this is just basic psychology, is how they react when it's threatened, right? You threaten to shoot Hector Salamanca, You know, you threaten to put him in prison. Whatever. He'll go to the DEA and tell them through the dings to, you know, S-U, okay, we get it. Right? But what finally motivates him to do something is when Gus says, your line will end here. Your legacy is destroyed. And that is what motivates Hector Salamanca to collaborate with a, by the way, very Mike-like Walter to kill Gus at the end of the series. Spoilers galore, by the way. So what motivates Hector to acting is threatening his legacy. And this is just one example of how legacy is important to the characters in Breaking Bad. And ultimately it becomes important to Walter too. He dies, as I say, caressing his legacy, or what he thinks is his legacy. In fact, Walter is deluded badly. But anyway, that's sort of my take on Hector, a little bit.
Anybody have anything else to say about Hector? And I'm going to throw it over to everybody. Did either of you address Hector in your chapters?
I was just remembering that that's the same, that the family is all that episode. The Cousins is the same one where you get Hank's moment of terrifying existential doubt after the beating of Jesse Pinkman. And he's like, I'm just not the man I thought I was. I think I'm done as a cop. Right, and that it's so extraordinary. It suddenly occurs to me that those are happening in the same episode, where those two reflections on man and legacy.
And Hank, what I'm right in saying, is his identity is in his work. He is being a cop. I mean, that's who he is.
And we were talking before the panel too. We were noting the quote toward the end. Walt buries his money, passes out, wakes up, and he makes Skyler promise he won't give away the money, and he refers to it as my life's work. And that seems kind of related, I think, to your idea of legacy.
Especially considering he was only doing it for a year.
Yeah.
And suddenly it becomes his life's work.
That's interesting on masculinity in regards to a stereotypical ethnic way of looking at masculinity too, is that we have these non-American men who their legacy with Gus and with Hector, it's about what my history was, what my family was, what other things outside, and then we have Hank and Walt, and it's their work. It's their capital gain. It's whatever's involved with the capitalist notion of who they are is what they hold on to their masculinity. And it's quite interesting that there's those paradigms that are different. And then Jesse, of course, can't be masculine because he didn't turn into anything capitalist. And according to
He's throwing his money away.
Yeah, he threw his money away, and so now and so it's interesting to think about masculinity in terms of those cultural shifts, because there's so much in Breaking Bad and so many cultures, and then how those cultures stack up against each other in regards to being a man, because Hector is very upset with Walt, and it's Gus who brings him in and puts Walt in his place. And it's interesting that those who see themselves as a man in regards to their legacy and not their work seem to be in some way more masculine than Walt and the others. And that scene, I'm thinking about that, you know.
Well, Jesse is a fascinating case. I think I'll talk about this more tomorrow. But Jesse he's not concerned with legacy. His concern is survival. That's what he's not worried about the future. He's worried about the now.
Mm-hmm.
And that puts him closer to the female characters in the show. They're worried about the now. They're worried about protecting what we have now. So Jesse, and partially his youth, partially his values, partially the fact that Jesse seems to suffer from an excessive conscience, which is, whereas Walt suffers from an extreme conscience deficit. So put it in medical terms. So and there was something else, but Jesse, the fact that he's throwing away all his money. What I find curious about that, and I mentioned this in my legacy paper, is look how Walter responds to him. Like, you're throwing away your legacy. My God, you're not honoring my values. You're not, the things that are important to you aren't the things that are important to me. And that just sticks in his craw.
And Skyler responds the same way to their money that Jesse does to his. She sees it as a burden, as something that's weighing her down and that she has to manage, and in some ways becomes the keeper of, and then she wants to just stop. I mean, it's very true. Skyler and Jesse kind of go through the same.
I didn't expect this much money to come in.
Yeah, and it can stop. Like, whatever we're going to do with this? Like, we have a pallet full. Did you know this? Did you know this?
She's praying for silverfish. Yeah, that's what the money means to her. Fair point. Yeah. I was gonna ask then, Nick, pick a character, talk about business.
Well, Walter certainly functioned in an environment in which all the other drug dealers, the distributors and so forth were all guys. I mean, it was truly an old boys network there. And it was all boys rules and, if you get in my way, I'll kill you, basically. So I could pick lots of those different guys there. I'm not gonna pick just anyone. Let me venture down a side path here first. I was also greatly intrigued by the two key females who came to assume business roles by season 4. Skyler, at the car wash, suddenly now thrust into a managerial position. I mean, this is just my male eyes looking at her. This is a car wash. You got a woman showing up there in short skirt and heels. It's like, you're gonna get a little dirty here. This is a car wash, but she was running it like it was a Fortune 500 company and doing a good job at it. Okay, and then we got Lydia come along, who is, quintessential feminine, yet holding down a very managerial type position. I had to wonder whether the show's writers brought those two women into business positions because, oops, we kind of made this a boys show here, or were they bringing them in for other reasons? Because I also felt like they were kind of miscast or mistreated. They were kind of, considered like, they're just bitches, they're, typical women can't handle like the boys do, and so I thought that always bothered me. But here was the thing that really stuck out to me in terms of characters, and it was Gus Fring. Here was a guy who, for all intents and purposes, ran his empire like a stereotypical man. Anybody who would step in his way, he would kill him. There would be no stopping. He didn't have a problem with that. He demonstrated his masculinity by letting Victor have it with the box cutter. He was fearless, he was unflinching, he just did it. And yet here was the man juxtaposed who was always fussing with his clothes. Enjoyed more time in the kitchen than any other thing. You had to wonder, because we didn't get much backstory on Gus. We got bits and pieces, we got some flashbacks to Mexico and so forth. But there was always somebody wondering somewhere online, wherever I happened to be reading, is that guy gay? They wondered about his orientation because he demonstrated what would stereotypically be considered effeminate traits for an American male. And so that character always stood out to me. Here was the guy who, his outward side was, extremely macho, very, very masculine, and yet, if you watched him closely, he didn't look like the typical disheveled guy that you would expect in the drug business. He was too well suited for that. So.
Yeah, actually, those are 2 points possibly worth talking about if anybody would like to chime in, because the issue with the two women later in the series, and Skyler from the beginning, and we have, in the book, we have a few chapters that are roundtable discussions where we all talk about a particular issue that wasn't addressed in one of our chapters, but that seemed to need to be addressed. And one of those was the Skyler-hating. I mean, if you've been around the fandom at all, you know that the hatred of Skyler White is almost religious for some of these. This is a passionate hatred, and Anna Gunn wrote a piece in the New York Times saying about, I have character issues, and she's had her life threatened, and really people took their Skyler hate a little seriously. And then you brought up Lydia. Interestingly, Lydia has no hate groups per se. And yet,
She's terrible.
and she's a horrible human being. But yeah, and so you get these two women being rather strong at the end there. And